Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel on the road to 2000. So, without wasting any time, let's get into the game. On this game, I started with the bets opening, pawn to f4. My opponent played pawn to d5. Then I played knight to f3. My opponent played knight to f6. Then I played pawn to e3, continuing with my development of the bets opening. My opponent played bishop to g4, pinning my knight to the queen. Then I played pawn to h3. Then my opponent took the knight with the bishop. Here there's a trick if you want to learn in the bets opening. If your opponent in these positions plays bishop to h5, it's a mistake because you then play pawn to g4, then the bishop after plays to g6, then you play pawn to f5, and then you win yourself a bishop. If you try the bets opening sometime, maybe your opponent will make that same mistake. But if your opponent doesn't make the same mistake as my opponent didn't, and takes the knight, and then you can just take back with the queen. So that was just something that I wanted to show you. Let's continue with the game. And then after that, my opponent played pawn to e6. Then I played knight to c3. Then my opponent played pawn to a6. Then I played bishop to d3. The reason this is an inaccuracy is because the computer wanted me to play pawn to g4, which is attacking the king side. But I'm going to attack the king side the same way, but I first played bishop to d3, and after that my opponent played pawn to h6. Then I played pawn to b3. My opponent played bishop to b4, attacking my knight, but it's already protected with the pawn. But then I played bishop to b2, increasing the defense on the knight. And then my opponent castled the king side. This is a mistake because the king side is being attacked with more of my pieces, so that's why this is a mistake. But then my opponent, after castling, I played pawn to g4, attacking the king side, of course. Then my opponent played pawn to c6. Then I played pawn to h4. My opponent then took the knight, and then I took back with the bishop. Then my opponent played knight to h7. I guess my opponent didn't want their knight to be captured, hence they moved it. Then I played pawn to g5. Then my opponent played knight to d7. Then I captured the pawn. Then my opponent took back with their own pawn. Then I played rook to g1 with a check. And then my opponent resigned. The game is not over. It can still go a long way. So my opponent, to cover this check, was to play knight to g5, and then I'll take with the pawn. Then after capturing with the pawn, which is a very big mistake, the best move is to ignore the pawn or to move the king out of the way, but the king cannot really move because it's being attacked with the two bishops. So, as I said, the game was over in this position. Then if my opponent, of course my opponent was gonna capture the pawn, and then he has just moved into, I just play queen to h5, and then my opponent had to play, of course they cannot move the pawn, so I don't know, maybe playing pawn to f6, protecting the pawn. And then after I couldn't capture with the pawn, capturing with the knight, and there's also mate in one. So after playing pawn to f6, it's just mate in one. So I guess that was the best move forward. The game was over actually, so no need to analyze further. So that's how the game actually played out. This is not really the game for this video. I just wanted to show you this game because it's not really a long game. So now let's get into the real game for this video. So let's get into the next game. On this game, I started with the king's pawn opening, pawn to e4. My opponent responded with pawn to c5. Then I played knight to f3. Then my opponent played the Caracan defense with pawn to d5. Then I played pawn to e5. Then my opponent played bishop to g4, pinning my knight to the queen. Then I played pawn to d4. My opponent played pawn to e6. Then I played pawn to h3 attacking the bishop. Then my opponent went for that bishop and knight exchange. Then I took back with the queen. Then my opponent played pawn to c5 looking for the pawn exchange. Then I ignored it and then I played bishop to b5 with a check. Then my opponent covered that with the knight to c6. Then I played pawn to c3, strengthening my pawn structure. My opponent played pawn to a6, attacking my bishop. Then I took the knight, which is the best move. Then my opponent took back with the pawn. Then I castled the king side. Then my opponent took my center pawn. Then I took back with the pawn that I just pushed earlier. Then my opponent went for another pawn exchange with pawn to c5, which this time I accepted. Then my opponent took back with the bishop. And then I played knight to c3. Here the computer liked it if I played queen to g5, attacking the g7 pawn. But then I played knight to c3. My opponent played knight to e7. Then I played queen to g3, attacking the g7 pawn. My opponent castled the king side. Then I played king to h1. The reason I played king to h1 is because I wanted to move the pawn on f2, and the pawn was pinned to the king, so I couldn't move it if the king was still there. But this is a mistake anyway. But then my opponent played knight to g6. Then I played pawn to f4, which was the idea all along. My opponent played pawn to f6. Then I played pawn to f5, attacking the knight. My opponent just captured back with the pawn. Then I took with the knight, which is a mistake. The reason this is a mistake is because this gives my opponent the advantage to have two passed pawns in the middle of the board, and they're going to be very difficult to defend, and these pawns are also connected, so hence that taking with the rook was a mistake. So here the best move for me after my opponent captured my pawn was to take the pawn on f6 first, and then if my opponent maybe captures with the rook, but the best move was to capture with the pawn, or the queen, capture with the queen. Of course I cannot capture this pawn anyway, it's just a blunder, so hence that was the mistake. But my opponent missed the mistake and took the pawn with the knight, which is not a bad move, it's just that it stops the two passed pawns in the center. Then I played bishop to h6, looking for this checkmate, but then my opponent played knight to f7, covering the checkmate threat. Then my opponent played then I played rook to f1, which is another mistake because the queen can play to d7, attacking the rook on f5? Yes. But then my opponent missed it and then played pawn to d4, attacking my knight. Then I played knight to e4. Then my opponent played bishop to e7, protecting the bishop on the f6 square, because I was capturing with the knight, and the bishop and the pawn was also being attacked with the two rooks, and of course the pawn is pinned to the king, so it cannot protect its mate. So hence playing knight to e4 was the correct move for me. But then playing bishop to e7 doesn't really help for my opponent, so I just took the pawn anyway with the knight, which is the brilliant move. Now it's a check. Then my opponent either moves or captures the knight. It's not the first move to capture the knight, it's just a check. It's either my opponent moves or captures the knight. So my opponent captures the knight with the bishop, then I capture back with the rook, which is another brilliant move. Of course the pawn cannot capture the rook because it's pinned to the king. It's either my opponent captures the rook with the with the rook or with the queen. So my opponent captured my rook with my opponent ignored the rook. Capturing the rook is also a mistake because this leads to this. So capturing the rook is not an option, because even if my opponent captures with the queen, I can just capture, and my opponent cannot capture because this leads to this. So that was not going to work. As my opponent ignored capturing the rook and then played queen to e7, and then I took the rook on f7, and then my opponent took back with the queen. Capturing with the knight here doesn't really work because it leads to checkmate, so capturing with the queen is the only move that stops the checkmate. Then after I played the rook to f7, my opponent captures with the queen, then I capture the queen. Then my opponent captures the rook with the knight, which is a mistake, which leads to mate in 1. The best move here was to capture with the king, of course, because after a check with the queen, the king can either move here or move here. But that moving to the e8 square doesn't work because this leads to this, so that's why that doesn't work. The best move was to move king to e6, but then we didn't get that far. The game played after my opponent captured the rook with the knight, and then that was checkmate. So that's how the game ended. It was a very good game with 2 brilliant moves, which I'm impressed by myself. So I think that's it. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and until we see each other on the next video, that's it from me.